Thank you all for coming to my session. This is a talk that I developed and gave for an international conference in Greece this summer, for which I received faculty development funding. And they asked that I also deliver it at Marymount so everybody could see what I was doing. So the name of this talk, the conference I was giving the talk at was the Conference for the International Association for the Study of Popular Romance. And romance novels, genre fiction, is something that I study. And this particular talk is looking at one series, which is romantic steampunk. And I got interested in it because I'm a Victorianist originally, and because I'm really interested in the way people use reconceptions of history and sort of fantastical history to try and deal with both historical topics and contemporary topics. And this series is a really good example of that because it blends some sort of historical motifs with cutting-edge technology and also technology that does not exist yet. So it has those sort of science fictional elements as well. The 19th century was fascinated by the relationship between humanity and technology. And this fascination gave us a lot of iconic literary images. This picture is from the 1931 movie Frankenstein, of course, based on the book by Mary Shelley that was written in 1818. And that's sort of a seminal moment for that people look at when they're thinking about the relationship between technology and humanity in the 19th century, brought to life as it was in this movie. Frankenstein brings his creature to life. In the 19th century, you also have mill workers fighting the dehumanization of technology in works by Charles Dickens, by Elizabeth Gaskell. And you have Captain Nemo, who is exploring under the sea with this sort of imagined technology that Jules Verne came up with. The fascination with technology is at the heart of steampunk, which is a modern movement that reimagines 19th century history and culture in terms of the fantastical or in terms of futuristic technology. So when I'm talking about steampunk, I like to use Margaret Rose's definition of the genre as a type of alternate history with nexus points in moments of technological change. As a student of Victorian literature, I'm fascinated by the way that steampunk reinvents the content, the concerns, the aesthetics of 19th century literature. And as you can see from her definition, steampunk is an umbrella term that can be applied to books that you might consider science fiction or fantasy or horror, but they all engage with the 19th century in some way in an alternate history mode. The series I'm looking at is called the Iron Seas series. It's by an author named Mel Jean Brooke, and she's written a bunch of texts that are part of this series. Some of them are complete novels and some of them are shorter novellas, but they're all part of this same world. Last spring in April, I presented my first paper on this series, and I was looking particularly at The Iron Duke, which was her first full-length novel in the series. And I was looking at representations of empire and colonialism, which are really important. But for this talk, I switched my focus to the technological aspects of the series, which are fascinating and they're complicated. And my argument is that these books revisit the 19th century questions about the impact of technology on humanity in ways that are inspired by the 19th century ideas about technology and humanity and mechanization, but also 21st century advances in things like robotics. Before I get into my argument, I'm going to give you guys a brief overview of the Iron Seas world so you know what I'm talking about, focusing particularly on the technological side. So the nexus point, that point where real history turns into alternate history in the Iron Seas world, is both political and technological. So Mel Jean Brooke imagines a world in which Marco Polo's mission to the Great Khan of the Mongolian Empire resulted in a group of European scientists being imprisoned by Mongolian leaders in order to initiate a program of intense biological and technological research. And then 2 centuries later, the Mongolian Empire, which she calls the Horde in these books, starts gradually conquering Europe and Africa using giant machines that were developed with the help of these European scientists. So these giant war machines crush opposing armies. They also have developed microscopic nano agents that can turn populations into mindless zombies or docile servants depending on the programming of the nano agents. So lucky people from Europe, Africa, and England flee to the New World, and the bulk of remaining people in Africa and Europe are turned into zombies, while the people of England are turned into passive slaves under the control of the nano agents. This is a map of what actually happened when the Mongols tried to conquer Europe, which is that they got turned back. So this is the moment that in Brooke, for her alternate history, she imagines, what if they hadn't been? And the reason that they weren't was because they had these technological advances that did not exist in the real history. So in her world, the Mongolian occupiers are using their advanced technology in England to physically alter most of the population, amputating limbs, grafting new appendages, according to the work they're assigned. They're using them as a work colony. And that lasts for 2 centuries until the radio signal tower that controlled everybody and kept them docile is destroyed. And then the series opens 10 years after that revolution. So she's imagining England basically as a labor colony that's been oppressed for 2 centuries that has just been liberated, while the rest of Europe, which is populated by mindless zombies and some Horde outposts, is still under Horde control, as is most of Africa. So, as I said, the connection between people and technology in these stories is intimate and complicated, and that's what I'm really focusing on. Some characters are infected, which is the word that the characters use, with nano agents, the little robots that are injected into their bloodstream, which make them stronger and faster to heal, but also open them up to emotional control by these radio towers that can dampen their feelings, their responses, their initiative, their will. Some characters have prosthetic limbs or other alterations, either forced on them by the Horde or added by choice, or as a result of an accident. Some characters have been genetically altered, and some characters are uninfected and unaltered, but must learn to live with people that are. So there's all different kinds of permutations of people and their relationship to technology. So these connections raise a giant question, which is how are people impacted by this intimate connection with technology? How does that impact their understanding of the world, and how does that impact their understanding of the self? What is our relationship with technology? Those are huge questions, and for the purposes of this talk, I'm narrowing my focus to the question, how does the connection between people and technology impact the ways they understand and express emotion, particularly in the context of romantic relationships? And these books are all romances, and so what she's looking at when she's looking at how people respond to technology is through the lens mostly of romantic relationships and trying to form that intimate connection with another person. So, a little bit of historical background. The 19th century saw an explosion of different scientific theories and ideas. Some of them formed the basis of scientific thought today, and others fall into the category of what we now call pseudoscience. Oops, sorry, skip that slide. In his book, The Romantic Machine, John Tresh describes one impact of new discoveries in technology. In the early 19th century, the distinctions between a machine as that which is moved by an external force and an organism as a system whose motive force is internal often broke down. The exemplary machines of the Romantic era, powered by steam, electricity, and other subtle forces, could be seen to have their own motive force within them. They were presented as ambiguously alive. And this is the period in which Mary Shelley was writing Frankenstein, and people were trying to figure out, what makes people come alive? If I put an electrical current through a frog leg and it jumps, a dead frog leg, and it jumps, does that mean that electricity is the source of life? Is there some way to bring people back to life? And when we create machines, what's that line between life and just animation that's been constructed? So Tresh argues that in the early 19th century, the Romantic period, that was a blurred distinction. And he argues that a more rigid distinction was reinstated between mechanical devices and organic life by the middle of the 19th century. But Tamara Kitabian, in her book, The Lives of Machines, argues that we can still see the blurring of those lines throughout the Victorian period, often in figurative language, where machines are described as animals or people are described as machines. So there's still some blurring of these categories that happens. In Dickens's novel Hard Times, Katabdian points out that, quote, "We encounter the working class's need for physical relief as a form of hydraulic pressure dangerously intensified by the performance of regular mechanical labor." So it's as though the people are machines and they're under pressure and they will blow if they don't get some sort of pressure relief valve. That's the metaphor that's being used. So the steampunk world of Mel Jean Brooks' stories picks up and amplifies those tensions that existed in 19th century literature and the continuities between humanity and machinery, but through the introduction of fantastical technology that conceptually links the romantic machines, the machines that could be considered alive, that Tresh described, with 21st century robotics, which sort of fulfills those links of people who are machine or part machine, or who can be described as machines. So the technology she introduces in the Ironseeds world shares the conflicted nature of 19th century technology. It can be deadening and dehumanizing, as factory work was so often described, but can also be empowering and positively transformative. As in the 19th century, this has as much or more to do with the agency of those interacting with the technology. So it comes back to the people. For example, the Horde in her books forcibly modified England's population for labor, replacing their body parts with tools. And their intentions and the way the process was carried out was dehumanizing. And those who were modified in this way are sometimes seen by non-modified people, those who escaped modification or those who fled to the New World and then come back after the Revolution, as less than human. However, in the aftermath of the Revolution in these books, there are some characters who choose modifications, like a man who has guns grafted to the steel arms that the Horde gave him, or a pirate who replaces her teeth with steel jaws, like razor blade sharp. When it comes to these types of mechanical enhancements, Brooke is careful to foreground the individual's choice or the lack thereof, not the process itself. There's nothing inherently wrong with the mechanical body or those modifications in her books. It all comes down to how they take place. As an interesting side note, the villains in these stories tend to be unmodified characters who either don't have or outright reject the technology that permeates the world. So there isn't a linkage between technology and villains here, which is something that you do often see, that the villains are also technically adept. Think about James Bond, right? The villains are the ones that have the giant rockets hidden under an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. In these books, technology is not demonized. There's a more complex type of mechanical modification in her world, which is the introduction of those nano agents, microscopic mechanical bugs or robots, she doesn't use the word robots, into people's bloodstreams. One strand of those nano agents is the strand that turned people into zombies in Europe and Africa. Another strand is the one that was introduced into England through imported food, actually, tea and sugar, that allowed the Horde to control the population of England through this radio signal. The Horde enslaved those with nano agents by dampening their emotions into apathy, using microscopic internal machines to control people's emotions, makes an explicit connection between physical chemistry and tissue and affective response, your emotional responses, which is a connection that was just beginning to be theorized in the 19th century as an extension of automatic physical reflexes. In the 19th century, people were interested in, what is the connection between the body and what's inside the body and the emotion, the spirit, which people had presumed before were separate. In the 19th century, people started bringing those together. And in these books that reflect back in the 19th century, we see those same interests. The nanoagent infection that was forced on the English people when the Horde invaded then becomes a matter of voluntary choice. After the Revolution, people can choose to become infected because it helps them heal, because it helps them be stronger. It has a lot of advantages. And so people will make that choice. The nanoagents don't just control emotions, they have a lot of benefits. And for many people, the improved quality of life with nanoagents outweighs the danger that there will be another signal tower that could go up that could control them. And that's a decision that people make. Even with the benefits of some modifications, characters have complex feelings about their modifications. One example from one of the books is David, who loses an eye, an arm, and both legs in an explosion as a child. When he becomes an adult, he decides to infect himself with nanoagents and have prosthetics grafted to his body, which is a process that's helped by having these mechanical bugs that can repair your wounds and things like that, to replace what was lost in his explosion. At one point he says, quote, "I did this to myself, and sometimes it's grotesque even to me. Not always because I don't think of them much unless I'm aware that someone is looking, and they're damn useful, but I have moments." So he has these conflicted feelings, and it has a lot to do with whether or not he's in the presence of somebody else and he's being looked at and engaged with. So the connection between people and technology in this world is intimate and complicated. Because these technologies originated in and symbolize the Horde's oppression of the English, they are viewed with suspicion, disgust, and fear by those who lived in independent, uncolonized territories. And of course, people who were modified against their will by the Horde also have conflicted feelings about their connection to machinery. So, given the intimate, often permanent connection between people and technology in these stories, and the mixture of negative and positive outcomes of the technology, simply rejecting technology as bad or dehumanizing is not an option for many of these characters. So instead, what we can see in these stories are a variety of ways characters resolve their relationships to technology, often by tapping into ideas reminiscent of Tresch's romantic machine. And one of the key ways we can see this resolution of the self-machine tension is through figurative language, particularly when it's applied to romantic or emotional situations. So I'm going to give a few different examples of that drawn from different stories in the series. My first example comes from Riveted, which is the third full-length novel in the series. That's the one that David is in, that I just talked about. The heroine of Riveted is Annika, an engineer who grows up repairing and driving mechanical trolls. She is so familiar with this machinery that she imagines these machines as a living thing. As you can see from this quote, when Annika drove, she saw the engines as a heart and the machinery as muscle and sinew, extensions of her own. It's no surprise then that she translates this technological language into her own body. When she imagines what love will be like, she thinks it will be as if her guts had been riveted together. So she's taking the language of machinery and transforming it to language about herself. And she does this throughout the novel, often describing her feelings during sexual encounters as rivets inside her being tightened or loosened. The hero of the novel, David, who I quoted earlier, uses less figurative language than Annika does, but her easy identification with machinery translates to an easy acceptance of his prosthetics, urging him to touch her with both hands, the mechanical hand, the metal hand, and his other hand, and she responds to both equally. So her familiarity with machinery and her tendency to think of herself in terms of a machine, and machines in terms of people, helps her connect with David, who has felt so distanced from people because of his prosthetics. Annika isn't the only character who imagines her body in the language of machinery. Yasmin, who's the heroine of Heart of Steel, which is the second novel in the series, uses that title phrase, Heart of Steel, to describe herself from the beginning. Yasmin herself is a nexus of technology, animal, and human. Her genetic code is part caracal, which is a kind of hunting cat, and she is infected with nanoagents. She was designed to become a human weapon, what the Horde called a steel flower, and would have had most of her body replaced with mechanical flesh, which is sort of an extended, sophisticated level of prosthetics, if she hadn't escaped first from the Horde. So she was a genetic engineering, not experiment because they had perfected it at this point, but she was genetically engineered. She was supposed to become part machine, part human. She escapes, but she grew up with this, and you can tell in the way that she thinks about herself. You know, typically English idioms are you have a heart made of stone or a heart made of ice, and here she has a heart made of steel. That's the metaphor that she goes to. And that suggests that she has internalized the idea of her hybrid nature, even though it wasn't carried to its conclusion, and she doesn't have the prosthetic modifications that she would have gotten. She's internalized this idea. The hero of her book, Archimedes, has nanoagents, but no other modifications. Nevertheless, Yasmin describes him in metallic terms, not mechanical, but metallic. She says he has balls of iron and a silver tongue, so you get that sort of continuity in the language. Although Yasmin falls in love with Archimedes, it doesn't change how she views her heart. In the follow-up novella that continues their story after they get together at the end of Heart of Steel, she acknowledges, quote, Archimedes had made his way into her heart, but it was still made of steel. And in this case, the hard, mechanical-sounding heart doesn't mean a lack of love, which is something else that we tend to associate, that if you're if you have a sort of mechanical response, that's not emotional and that's not loving. And in that novella, that gets flipped around. She can have a steel heart and still be part of this romantic relationship. Both of these are pretty simple examples of characters using figurative language to positively represent the relationship between technology and themselves. However, Brooke also uses figurative language to expose the conceptual shift that that figurative language of technology represents. The best example is the novella Salvaged, which focuses on Tom, a salvager who grows up in Horde-occupied England, and Georgie, his wife, who grew up in a free territory. Tom's arms were amputated by the Horde and replaced with skeletal steel prosthetics and pneumatic braces across his chest so that he can haul fishing nets. That was his job under the Horde rule. After the revolution, he leaves England in search of a new life and falls in love with Georgie. However, a linguistic misunderstanding separates them for years and almost ends their marriage. Georgie grew up with a father who was always traveling, so when she married Tom, she said the one thing she wanted for him, was for him to hold her in his arms every night. To her and to most English speakers, this seems like a simple request for presence. I want you to be home every night so we can be together. But that isn't how Tom interprets it. As you can see from this exchange, Tom took her idiom literally. He had not thought about prosthetics when he was in England, but not where he lives near the North Sea. He'd known that she hadn't envisioned a man holding her in an iron cage. So that's what he thinks of when he hears her say, I want you to hold me in your arms. He thinks, I don't have arms. They're not real arms, and that's not what she meant. And Georgie realizes this once they come back together after their long separation, and she thinks that she hadn't meant it literally. The important part wasn't his arms, it was that he was going to be there for her, with her, but that's not how he took it, and she thinks that she had been thoughtless and cruel and selfish because she hadn't thought about how a man who had steel arms might interpret that language that she used so naturally. So here you can see that the language, the limitations of traditional language aren't sufficient to this technologically interdependent world. So the way that the technology impacts people is actually deeper than just sort of surface level changes, that it actually makes you rethink the way that language is used and how you express yourself when you're communicating with somebody else. And Georgie didn't realize this, even though she does get herself infected with nanoagents. She hadn't thought about the extent to which the technological world demanded a new set of language or a new use for language or new thoughts about how language works. So there's still a lot of work that I could do with these ideas. This is sort of my first exploration into them. I could look more deeply into studies of figurative language in 19th century representations of machinery and the multiple intersections of human, animal, and mechanical episodes in these books. Of course, I wouldn't say that these stories are unique in the steampunk genre for their exploration of the relationship between humanity and technology. That's sort of the common thread in steampunk fiction, is the human and the machine. But the romantic focus in these stories allows for a recuperative, integrated, and intimate representation of humanity and technology through the love story. As we see time after time in fiction and film, technology could destroy us. It's a really common theme in most things. But it's possible that what's missing in all of these apocalyptic technological nightmares is the emotional integration found in a good romance, which is something that's demonstrated in these books. And that is the end of my talk. And there are a couple of minutes for questions, if anybody has any questions. Marguerite.
I'm curious if you've thought about how well these narratives fit in sort of narratives of disability and ageing too, right? Because all the metaphors of sort of slave literature apply also in terms of both fear and community.
Uh-huh.
How characters negotiate between them.
Yeah, I have thought about that. Actually, when I gave this paper the first time, one of the other people on the panel was a disability studies, or one of the other people in the room was a disability studies expert, and so we talked a lot about how that literature could influence this study going forward. I think there's probably a lot of overlap that I haven't had a chance to look into yet in terms of how relationships are represented and through different kinds of genres and things like that.
Especially the choice to be infected or not infected, and the sort of sense of empowerment through infection. At the same time, there's fear surrounding it.
Yeah, and it is interesting because it's trying. I think Brooke is intentionally trying to reverse some of those negative perceptions of disability, also of the idea of infection. I wrote this before Ebola was a thing, but if you're thinking about fear and infection, like we have a good example of how that works right now.
But also empowerment, like the AIDS literature that came out of the 80s and 90s, right, was very much about a sense of community based on contagion and infection and survival.
Mm-hmm.
And an alternate community that sort of is built very much through disease, and you bump into those in cancer narratives too, right? I would change it into mindscape to be a better person.
Yeah, and this is sort of like that, except for because she's doing the imaginative thing, it's on a sort of larger national and international scale, which is interesting. Doug?
Wondering, as you look at all of the books by this author, if you see a change in the way that she deals with these larger issues, or her handle with the craft of the genre.
So I haven't read The Kraken King, which is the last full-length novel. It came up at the end of the summer. It does seem like she's gotten more interested in interactions between people who are modified and not modified as she goes on. So The Iron Duke, the first book, takes place, or all of the characters are English for the most part, and takes place within that particular post-colonial, in this instance, context. And as the books go on, she spends more time looking at people from other places who had different interactions with the technology and different interactions with the Horde. And it seems like she's gotten more interested in exploring the larger world as opposed to just this one particular post-revolutionary moment. I can't say for certain. I can't make like a statement about how she might have changed her approach to the technology or the way that people relate to it, because I haven't sat down to try and track that specifically through all of the stories yet. Any other questions? Eric.
This is more like a comment, really, but sorry.
Yeah.
I was just, as we were talking, I was thinking just how interesting the way in which the history of Frankenstein and this moment in romantic literature, how the Luddite movement is sort of taken up as this sort of hatred of technology just in the moment, and the culture is so fascinated with these sorts of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, that was the extent.
Yeah, I could definitely look more at the Luddites and the sort of nuances of 19th century technological change. Like that's one of the things that I think would be interesting. In this book, you don't get Luddites in the sense that, well, I guess you do. It's more extreme. You get people who are trying to destroy everybody that has nanoagents in their body. So it's not breaking the machine, or breaking the machines is breaking the people in these books. So it's a more extreme suggestion that technology is so integrated that you can't get rid of it, which is what the Luddites sort of discovered too, that they could not get rid of the technology. But in 19th century England, it was still external, whereas in these books, trying to get rid of the technology involves mass murder. So, any other questions? All right, it's 10 o'clock, so I think I'm also out of time. Thank you very much for coming.